Shot. Then another one. No trace. Not so long ago, no one could believe that events could unfold in such a way. We all thought that evil had already been defeated. But as it turned out, it was just an illusion. The spring of 2024 had finally arrived, painting London green, but Dr. John Watson hardly noticed the beauty that spread around him. London lived, breathed, moved, and he seemed to be in another dimension, a world where time slowed down. 3 years have passed since Sherlock Holmes died in that fatal fight with Professor Moriarty. 3 years, but the pain of loss remained as fresh as the day he was informed of his friend's death. Watson's apartment was quiet, filled with the sounds of raindrops falling on the glass and the monotonous ticking of the clock on the wall. He lived alone now. Mary, his beloved wife, had died a few years ago, and although their marriage had not been easy, the loss was palpable. He could feel her absence in every corner of the apartment, just as he had felt the emptiness after Sherlock's disappearance. A lot has changed over the years, but the main thing has remained the same: the feeling of loneliness, which Watson could not drown out either by work or meetings with former colleagues. He closed his medical practice at the hospital and now engaged in private practice, visiting patients at home. It was a routine job that he carried out with mechanical precision, without feeling the same enthusiasm. But the days dragged on, and it helped to distract. Watson was sitting at his desk, with a tablet with notes on the last patient spread out in front of him, and was mechanically looking through messages on his smartphone. His life in 2024 was dominated by modern technology. He kept medical records on a tablet, used a smartphone for consultations and correspondence with colleagues, and in the evening from time to time, wrote posts on his blog dedicated to criminology and old investigations. The blog was his kind of outlet, a place where he could share his thoughts about criminology, analyze old cases, and remember Holmes. But each post brought only temporary relief, as if it were touching the very wound that was not healing in any way. Today's post was dedicated to the investigation of a 3-year-old case in which Holmes played a crucial role. Watson fixed his gaze on the screen. Words that once seemed important to him seemed to lose their meaning now. He put down the phone and sighed. It was especially noisy in London in the evening, and the sounds of cars and footsteps on the street filled the room with the echo of a city that never fell asleep. Sometimes, walking through the streets, Watson found himself looking closely at the faces of passers-by. Maybe it was just his imagination, but sometimes it seemed to him that a familiar silhouette was about to flash by. A tall man with the collar of his raincoat turned up, and a swift, confident step. He looked around. His heart began to beat faster, but then nothing. It was just someone else. Holmes was not there. He no longer existed. And each time, Watson felt the realization of this truth rolling in again, almost maddening. He tried to forget himself by immersing himself in his work. Watson became a man of habit. Every morning he started by making coffee and checking messages from his patients. He also received dozens of emails and notifications from subscribers of his blog. Some of them admired his stories about old investigations. Others criticized him for overly romanticizing Holmes. But most of the letters were of the same type. People were wondering what it was like to work with such a genius. But among these messages, Watson sometimes noticed strange letters. Every now and then, someone asked if it was true that Sherlock Holmes faked his death. It seemed that the legends about Holmes were still alive, and this rumor, like a virus frozen on the internet, could not fade away. Watson shuddered when reading such messages, realizing that they awakened in him strange, painful hopes, which he had been trying to get rid of for a long time. These were just silly speculations, the fruit of conspiracy theorists' fantasies. He tried to focus on his work, but his thoughts kept returning to that day the last time he saw Sherlock, the day everything collapsed. He remembered every moment, the cold wind, the stones crumbling under his feet, and how Holmes stood on the edge of the cliff, having engaged in a final battle with Professor Moriarty. The whole scene was still in front of his eyes, as if it was yesterday. Holmes's face distorted by tension, and the last look they managed to exchange before falling into the abyss. Watson rubbed his temples, trying to get rid of the memories. The whole thing with his blog only added to the sense of loss. Perhaps he got too carried away trying to perpetuate the memory of Holmes. Perhaps it was time to stop writing about the past and live in the present, but every new case that he analyzed in his notes brought him back again and again to the days when Holmes was alive, when they worked together solving the most complicated crimes. Watson understood that this had become a kind of way for him to keep in touch with a friend who no longer exists. He got up, went to the window and, raising his hand, wiped the fogged glass. London stretched out in front of him, as if in the palm of his hand, with its endless streams of cars, pedestrians, and smoke rising from the exhaust pipes. Colorful neon signs of cafes and shops flashed outside the window. The world seemed to be living its own life, oblivious to his pain. Watson smiled faintly. That's life. Sometimes he just wanted to disappear into this faceless crowd, become as inconspicuous as millions of other Londoners, walk down the street without turning around, not noticing the past. But he couldn't. Holmes was still with him, at least in my thoughts, at least in my memories. As if ironically, his phone vibrated. Watson glanced at the notification screen from the news app. The Piccadilly murder. An unknown criminal shot dead a young millionaire in his own home. The police are looking for clues. Watson opened the article out of habit, quickly scrolling through the text. It reminded him of the old days, when such news was the beginning of new investigations for him and Holmes. He knew it was just a coincidence, but something about the case, in his tone, made him think. Dr. Watson was sitting at the kitchen table, engrossed in reading an article about a recent murder in Piccadilly. A young millionaire startup, Ronald Adair, was found dead in his luxury apartment. A shot to the head, a locked door from the inside, no signs of forced entry. This case immediately attracted the attention of the London press. For Watson, such news was a painful reminder of the days before, when such events served as the beginning of another Holmes investigation. But Holmes was no longer there, and Watson was just a spectator, forced to watch from the sidelines as the story unfolds, which perhaps could become a new puzzle for them. His gaze skimmed over the text of the article again. Ronald Adair, a well-known young entrepreneur and founder of a successful startup, was found shot dead in his Piccadilly apartment on Friday night. The police are confused. There are no surveillance cameras, no signs of trespassing. The door was locked from the inside. The investigation is ongoing, but so far, the police have no suspects. Perhaps the killer used some kind of technological device or a carefully planned scheme to avoid detection. The details of the case are still being kept secret. Watson carefully reread the paragraph several times. This case was clearly not just a routine investigation. Something unusual was in the situation itself. A man was shot, but the police could not find any signs of entry. In the past, such puzzles would have been among the first cases that Sherlock Holmes would have wanted to solve, clinging to every, even the smallest detail. Watson couldn't help but remember how his friend enthusiastically sorted out such cases, paying attention to what others had overlooked. He was about to close the article when suddenly a message popped up on the smartphone screen. It was a notification from the police. He had been sent a request for a medical report on the Adair case. Watson read the text, and his eyebrows knitted in surprise. It was an unusual request. He was rarely called to the murder scene for an expert examination. Although he sometimes cooperated with the police, such requests were usually received in the case of complex or unusual cases. Obviously, this murder of Adair was just like that. Watson's habit of always being ready worked. He quickly packed up his things, a medical kit, a notebook, and a tablet for notes. His car was parked on the street, and 15 minutes later he was driving through evening London, heading to the city centre. The crime scene was located on one of the prestigious streets of Piccadilly. The high-rise building with spacious apartments on the upper floors represented architectural perfection, recently rebuilt to meet all modern standards. Watson went up to the 12th floor, where he was met by two policemen. One of them, Detective Inspector Lestrade, was an old acquaintance of Watson's. In the past, they had been involved in a number of investigations together when Holmes was still alive. "I'm glad we were able to come quickly," Lestrade said, shaking Watson's hand. "This is an unusual case. The police are confused, and we thought it would be interesting for you to see." "Tell me more," Watson replied shortly, walking through the hallway to Adair's apartment. The apartment where the murder was committed was a huge apartment with panoramic windows, modern interiors, and expensive furniture. Everything was here, from smart devices for controlling lighting and temperature to the latest security systems. However, it was the security system and CCTV cameras that proved useless in this case. Lestrade led Watson into the living room, where Ronald Adair's body lay. The young man was in an expensive suit, lying on his side facing the window. There was a small bullet wound in the exact middle of his forehead, a perfectly accurate shot that immediately raised suspicions that the killer was either a sniper or had used something more sophisticated. All the cameras in the house were functioning, but we didn't see anything, Lestrade began, pointing to a small monitor on the wall. The camera outside didn't record anything either, and this is not just a technical problem. We have checked the system. But the strangest thing is the door. It was locked from the inside. We opened it after we heard the shot. Watson nodded silently and moved closer to the body. Everything looked too neat. Shot in the head, no signs of a struggle or an attempt to escape. It was as if Adair had been killed when he was completely safe sitting in his chair, perhaps not even expecting an attack. Watson looked up at the window through which London was visible. High-rise buildings are far away on the horizon. If the killer was a sniper, he would need to get to this height somehow. Was there no sound of broken glass? Watson asked. Nothing. The glass is intact, no damage, Lestrade replied. We thought it was some kind of internal conflict, but according to our group, no one came in or out. Watson fell silent. Everything was even more mysterious than he could have imagined. He bent over Adair's body, checking his hands. They were clean, without traces of gunpowder or blood, which ruled out the possibility of suicide. The clothes were perfectly fitted, with no creases or signs of a struggle. Did you find anything unusual at the site? Watson asked, getting up. Not yet, except for the notebook on the table in which Adair was writing something. But there's nothing special there. Records of meetings and plans for the future, plus a tablet with personal data. We're taking it apart right now, Lestrade replied, pointing to the devices on the table next to the chair. Watson looked at the notebook. There was a small notebook on the table right in front of the chair in which Adair was sitting. He slowly opened it and began flipping through the pages. They were mostly boring business notes, lists of meetings and contacts, but one entry caught his attention. 17:30, meeting with M to discuss the old story. Who is M? Said Watson aloud, thoughtfully flipping through the pages. Lestrade shrugged his shoulders. We don't know. Not a single name for this letter was found in his contacts. Watson frowned, feeling a familiar sense of anxiety and curiosity begin to seep through the layers of his routine life. There was something about this mystery that reminded him of the past, about cases that seemed impossible until Holmes revealed them with amazing clarity. Suddenly, his phone vibrated. Watson looked at the screen. It was a notification strange, like everything that happens. The message came from an unknown number, and its text read, "Those who return sometimes come without warning. Look around." Watson's heart skipped a beat. He slowly looked up but saw nothing suspicious. Evening London seemed wrapped up in its usual hustle and bustle, and Watson walked slowly through the busy streets after a long and stressful day. His mind was on the mysterious murder of Ronald Adair. Despite all his attempts to focus on current affairs, his anxiety did not let go. A lot of questions were spinning in my head. Who is the M from the notebook? How did the killer escape the surveillance cameras and get into the apartment, locked from the inside? And why did his own feelings suggest that there was something familiar about this story? Something that gave him a vague sense of déjà vu. Cars were rushing by. People were hurrying about their business. But Watson seemed to be in another dimension, the enclosed space of his thoughts. London was living its normal life, but something was changing inside of it. The riddle seemed to demand an answer, and Watson felt a familiar uneasiness, the same craving for a solution that returned to him whenever he encountered something inexplicable. Only before, he had always known that there was a person nearby who could shed light on the darkest corners of such cases. But Sherlock Holmes was dead. With these thoughts, Watson walked along the rows of shops, not noticing the windows and advertisements, until his steps were interrupted by an unexpected collision. Someone pushed him sharply with his shoulder as they passed by. It was a deliberate move, not just a casual contact in the crowd. Watson screamed and automatically grabbed the hand of the one who pushed him, but the man quickly twisted away and almost ran on, hiding in the huge beam. "I'm sorry," Watson shouted after him, but his voice was drowned out by the hum of the street. There was something strange about this encounter. Watson slowly continued on his way, but now his mind switched to another level of alertness. He was convinced that this was not just an accident. This man was clearly trying to get his attention. Watson looked back in the direction the stranger had gone, but the street had already swallowed him up. Shortly before home, Watson felt that he had to go to the pharmacy. He needed to buy some small things that he usually forgot during the long days. Entering a small pharmacy store, he mechanically went to the shelves with medicines, hoping for some privacy and peace. However, the feeling of anxiety did not leave him. Watson took out his smartphone to take another look at the strange message he received at the murder scene. A message he chose to ignore at that moment. "Those who return sometimes come without warning. Look around." His heart started pounding again. He felt a slight chill run down his spine. Was this message related to the person who had just pushed him? At that moment, he heard a voice behind him, a voice that stiffened his nerves and made him freeze. "You're thinking too much, Watson." Watson froze. The sound of that voice was so familiar, so distinct, that his consciousness at first simply refused to accept it. He couldn't believe what he was hearing, not happening. He slowly turned around and saw a man standing in front of him between the shelves of medicines. Tall, thin, with a prickly gaze of gray-blue eyes, a familiar posture, and a strict style of clothing. He looked almost exactly the same as the last time Watson saw him on the cliff edge 3 years ago. "Sherlock." Watson barely breathed out, his voice sounding like an echo of his own disbelief. Holmes stood in front of him, alive and unharmed, with the same cold-blooded expression that Watson remembered to the smallest detail. The seconds dragged on endlessly as his mind tried to make sense of what was happening. It was shock, disbelief, confusion, all these feelings hit him at once. 3 years is too long a time to walk the streets of London without a definite purpose. Watson, how should I put it? I was sure you would notice my little hint. Watson felt his legs give way, and he almost fell into the nearest chair, which stood at the pharmacy's cash register. His heart was pounding in his chest, and everything seemed unreal, as if he had woken up in some kind of nightmare or lost touch with reality. But Holmes was here. He stood in front of him, as if he hadn't disappeared anywhere. It was impossible. But you, Watson finally managed to speak. You're dead. I saw it. You saw what I wanted you to see, Holmes replied calmly, interrupting him. Believe me, Watson, it was absolutely necessary. Watson still couldn't cope with the growing storm of emotions. Sherlock Holmes, his best friend, the man he thought was dead, stood in front of him, talking about his death as if it were just part of some clever plan. Did you fake your death? Watson said with difficulty, trying to make sense of what he had heard. Holmes nodded and leaned closer to lower his voice so that their conversation could not be overheard by passers-by. After Moriarty was dead, I had no other choice, Watson. I knew that his people would continue to hunt for me, for you. If I had been alive, they would have found a way to get to me, and to you at the same time. That's why I had to disappear. I needed time to expose the rest of his network of people. But to do that, I needed to disappear from the radar completely. Watson was silent, feeling all his thoughts, memories, and feelings turned upside down. How many times had he thought that Sherlock might have survived, that this was all some kind of mistake? How many times had he replayed that scene on the cliff in his head? But now it seemed pointless. Everything was carefully planned. Staging, lying, deception, all this in order to hide and play your game from behind the scenes. 3 years, Watson repeated softly, realizing how much time had passed since that moment. Have you been alive all 3 years? Where have you been? Holmes sighed and slightly shrugged his shoulders, as if all these 3 years had not mattered much to him. In different places, Watson. He started in France, then spent some time in Turkey, then in India and Central Asia. I've been looking for Moriarty's people all over the world, destroying their networks one by one. And now I'm back. I came back to finish what I started. Watson stared at him in a daze. All this time, Holmes was hiding from the world, gathering information and conducting his covert struggle with the remnants of the Moriarty gang. His friend, whom he thought was dead, was alive all this time, but could not make contact. Why didn't you tell me? There was a hint of resentment in Watson's voice. Why didn't you let me know you were alive? Holmes frowned, but his eyes remained calm. Precisely because it was dangerous, Watson. Any hint of my return would have jeopardized the entire operation. They were watching you, Lestrade, and everyone connected to me. Any contact with you could reveal my plan and destroy all efforts. I couldn't take any chances. These words did not lessen Watson's pain, but he began to realize that Holmes could not have done otherwise. He was always one step ahead. He always played by his own rules, even if it meant leaving everyone in the dark. And now, Watson asked, why did you decide to come back? Sherlock smiled at the corners of his lips and leaned closer. Because the time has come, my dear Watson. Surely you no longer have any doubts inside yourself why I came back right now. The murder of Ronald Adair is not just a crime. It's an echo of Moriarty. After his death, his criminal network was left without a leader, but his heirs appeared. Those who longed not only to preserve his legacy, but also to improve it. And I intend to stop it. And you will help me with this, my dear friend. Our target is Sebastian Moran. Oh my God, Holmes. This is the Sebastian Moran. Is this murder his doing? Watson exclaimed. Take your time, my dear friend. You'll find out soon enough, Sherlock Holmes replied. Watson was still in a state of shock at Holmes' unexpected return, but his amazement was quickly replaced by an urgent need to know more. It's as if all the events of recent years' loss, pain, loneliness suddenly made sense. Now he was facing not just a friend whom he thought was dead, but a man who found himself at the very center of a global conspiracy, the hunt for the surviving members of the Moriarty network. And now the main target of Holmes was Sebastian Moran, a cruel, ruthless, and extremely dangerous opponent. Sherlock Holmes and Watson were sitting in Watson's apartment, which has now become a makeshift headquarters, to discuss their next move. Sherlock, as always, was immersed in business, his thoughts working faster than others could keep up with him. Moran, Holmes said, throwing a clipboard with the details of the case on the table. Moriarty's right-hand man was Sebastian Moran, a former colonel in the British Army, a sniper expert. It's amazing how a man with such a level of training went underground, becoming an assassin and a professional in the criminal environment. Watson remembered the name. Moran was known in certain circles for his cruelty and composure, but after Moriarty's death, almost nothing was heard of him. After Moriarty was destroyed, Moran inherited his organization, Holmes continued. However, he is not a genius like his predecessor. Moran is a killer, a strategist, but he is not able to control the network with the same dexterity and accuracy. Therefore, over these 3 years, I have watched his influence gradually weaken, but his thirst for revenge, on the contrary, only increases. Do you think he was involved in Adair's murder? Watson asked, recalling the events of the day when he had to participate in the investigation. But why? What was his motive for this? Holmes looked at Watson, his eyes sparkling with the cold brilliance of a mind immersed in analysis. Ronald Adair was an accidental victim in a larger game, Watson. Moran knew that I would return to London sooner or later. He couldn't help but realize that if I was really alive, I would hunt him. Adair apparently became one of Moran's victims by mistake, or because he was removed as a witness. Perhaps he was connected to someone from the remnants of the Moriarty network without knowing it. Holmes gestured at the tablet that was connected to the projector. A complex diagram with many lines and photographs appeared on the wall, a network of criminal connections that stretched all over the world. People's faces, companies, financial flows, it all looked like a giant web, and at its center was Sebastian Moran. Have you collected all this data? Watson looked at the map in surprise. How did you manage it? Holmes chuckled. Time did not stand still, Watson. Over the past 3 years, technology has advanced, and now it serves me better than ever. I used tracking systems that were inaccessible even to the special services a few years ago. Artificial intelligence, social media data analysis, facial recognition software, and financial transaction tracking are all part of my job now. He paused, giving Watson a chance to reflect on what he had heard. Moran is a man of the old school. He used to rely on his sniper skills and personal connections, but the world has changed. He hides using traditional methods, but in the world of digital information, his every step can be tracked if you know where to look. Holmes scrolled through several pages of reports that flashed on the wall in front of them. I found out that Moran has recently returned to London. He keeps in touch with the few remaining members of the old Moriarty network. However, his main goal now is not the restoration of the Empire, but revenge. Moran wants to destroy everyone involved in Moriarty's death. And, of course, his main target is me. Watson felt a chill down his spine as he realized how serious this confrontation was. But why would he kill Adair? He asked the question again, and Holmes raised his hand, as if to indicate that he was now ready to reveal the main point. Adair was involved in underground money games, Holmes explained. He played big bets with high-ranking people, among whom was Moran. However, his death, I believe, was the result of Adair learning something he shouldn't have known. He was too close to those involved in the criminal network that Moran is trying to preserve as much as possible. Watson was silent. Holmes seemed to put everything on the shelves with amazing ease, although for others it would have been incomprehensible. Each piece of the puzzle gradually fell into place. Moran used his old skills to arrange this murder, Holmes continued. He's a world-class sniper, and the fact that the door was locked from the inside didn't stop him. He could have used remote-controlled weapons or modern technology to commit murder without being in the room. These technologies are now available, and Moran could have mastered them. But how do you plan to find him? Watson finally asked, if he's hiding so carefully. Sherlock turned on a new diagram on the screen, which showed several key figures, Moran's connections in London. I use deep network data analysis technology, Holmes explained, pointing to the dots and lines. The artificial intelligence that I have set up analyzes millions of posts, messages, and transactions. Moran leaves traces, albeit unconsciously. He tries to be careful, but his surroundings, the people he is associated with, give away his location. Every move of his people is another piece of the puzzle that leads to him. Holmes went on to talk about how they could track Moran using social media analysis, bank transfers, and surveillance cameras that cover the whole of London. He described in detail how this data helped him calculate the recent movements of Moran and his followers. Moran is a master of stealth, Holmes said, his eyes shining with enthusiasm again. But no one can completely disappear into our world, Watson. Watching him became only a matter of time and patience. Watson was amazed at how much investigative methods had changed in recent years. Although Holmes was always ahead of his time, he now used the most advanced technologies and tools that made him an even more formidable opponent. And what's next? Watson finally asked, watching Holmes collect the latest data on his tablet. Now that we know his tracks, Holmes replied, we need to wait for the moment when he makes a move. Moran will be looking for opportunities to strike, and we have to get ahead of him. Holmes picked up his smartphone, checked his messages, and smiled as if he saw something that only confirmed his theory. He's already taking the next step, Holmes said quietly. The game begins, Watson. Moran is our key to ending this story. Watson felt a sense of the old excitement reawakening inside him, a feeling he had not experienced since Holmes died. The old team was back in action, and now they were on the verge of another deadly fight. Holmes has always been a master of preparation and detail, and this time everything had to be perfect. Moran was planning another assassination attempt, and Holmes knew that it would happen very soon. All their work over the past few days has been reduced to this moment to catch a cunning opponent in his own trap. They chose the place for the final act with great care, an old abandoned mansion in an elite area of London, which was on the verge of destruction. Half of the house has already been demolished. Its massive brick walls are dilapidated, covered with mold and cracks. Once a luxurious house, now it was only a shadow of its former greatness, awaiting its fate to become another project for developers. The darkness, overhanging beams, and collapsed ceilings created an ominous atmosphere, the perfect place for a trap. An empty house, Watson said ironically as they approached the scene of action. It seems that it fully corresponds to its name. Holmes only smiled slightly. They stood on the sidewalk, studying the gloomy building. Everything looked perfect for their plan. There was no life inside, no electricity, no security, only silence and shadows. "Moran has always been a man of habits," Holmes said. "He prefers to operate from a distance, uses his sniper skills to hit a target from a long range. This is his style, cold and calculating. He will think that he has the full advantage." "Are you sure he's going to try to kill you here?" Watson asked, looking around the building. "Moran received information that I would allegedly appear in one of the neighboring houses at a meeting with a high-ranking official. This is a false lead that I set up through his contacts. Moran has always worked through intermediaries, and this makes him vulnerable to such traps." Holmes ran his hand over the tablet, which was connected to a small network of cameras and drones. The plan was thought out to the smallest detail. They had to lure Moran to the mansion and make him believe that he had the ability to kill Holmes. But in reality, it was different. Instead of using a wax figure like in the old days, Holmes said with a slight grin, "I decided to use a more modern solution." He opened one of the windows of the application on the tablet, and an image appeared on the screen, as if taken from the window of a neighboring house. A holographic figure could be seen in the window, the image of Holmes himself sitting at a table, working on papers. The figure looked so realistic that even Watson, who was well aware of the deception, almost doubted that it was just a hologram. "It's a holographic image," Holmes explained, "synthesized using a hidden drone that we placed on the roof of a nearby building. He will project my image directly into the window of this house. Moran will not be able to distinguish reality from illusion." Watson, who was used to the old Holmes methods, looked at the device in amazement. He always knew that his friend was at the forefront of using technology, but this was something special. Everything looked thought out to the smallest detail. "What if Moran suspects it's a trap?" Watson asked, still doubtful. "We have calculated all the possible risks," Holmes replied confidently. "Moran relies on his skills, on distance, and on the element of surprise. He will not approach to verify the authenticity of the target. He'll just have to pull the trigger. But he doesn't know that the bullet won't hit the real target. Instead of the usual detective methods, they now used modern technology, hidden cameras that transmitted images in real time, drones that provided surveillance of the entire territory, and access control systems that recorded every step on the objects surrounding the empty house. It all worked as one synchronized system controlled from Holmes' tablet. "Watson," Holmes said, turning to him, "we need you to help coordinate the surveillance. We will control everything from a distance. As soon as Moran shows up, we have to be ready to act instantly." Watson sat down at a computer connected to drones and cameras. Several video feeds from different angles were displayed on the screen in front of him. One was a view from a neighboring house. The other was a direct view from the roof of an abandoned mansion. Holmes constantly checked the picture of what was happening, keeping in touch with the police, who were on standby. "Moran will arrive from the south," Holmes said quietly, switching the cameras to one of the nearby intersections. "He will act covertly, perhaps even using forged documents. But it doesn't matter. We've already found him." Watson watched the monitors carefully, trying to keep all the details under control. It was a tense wait. Time passed slowly, and every minute they waited for Moran to appear. Half an hour later, one of the cameras mounted on the drone noticed a suspicious movement. A silver SUV parked at an empty building across the street, and a man in a dark hooded jacket got out of the car. Holmes immediately switched to this video feed. "There he is," he whispered. Moran walked confidently down the street, clearly unaware that he was being followed. He quickly found shelter in the shadows of dilapidated houses and began to deploy his equipment. Holmes peered at the tablet screen and, without taking his eyes off what was happening, gave the signal, "The positions are occupied." He's getting ready. Watson, keep an eye on him." Moran picked up his sniper rifle, which he had spread out on the roof of one of the neighboring buildings. His goal was clear, the window behind which he thought Sherlock Holmes was sitting. "Now," Holmes whispered, and a shadow of triumph flickered across his face. Moran, unaware of the deception, pointed the gun at the hologram of Holmes. At that moment, everything slowed down. Moran pulled the trigger. A loud gunshot cut through the silence. The bullet pierced the air, heading straight for the heart of the Sherlock sitting at the table. But instead of hitting the target, the bullet passed through the hologram, and the image disappeared, disappearing into thin air. Moran froze for a moment, realizing that he was trapped. He understood, Holmes stated coldly. At that moment, the police, who were waiting for the signal, began to act. Watson watched with bated breath as the SWAT team surrounded the building. Moran, apparently realizing that his plan had failed, tried to escape, but there was no way out in the alleys of London. The police promptly captured him. When Moran was neutralized, Holmes finally allowed himself to relax. He turned off the tablet, looked at Watson, and smiled slightly. "The game is over," he said softly. "Is it over?" Watson couldn't believe his eyes yet. "You caught him. You caught him." "Yes," said Holmes. "Moran is no longer a threat, but the Moriarty case is only now fully completed. He was the last one." Watson looked around the abandoned house and realized that from that moment on, all their battles with the ghosts of the past were over. When Moran was finally taken to a police van and the scene of the operation was cleared, Holmes and Watson, left on the street, were able to breathe a sigh of relief. The smell of wet asphalt was in the air, and for a moment London seemed to be quiet again. "Did you know it would end like this?" Watson asked, breaking the silence. "Did you know?" "No, I didn't," Holmes replied, looking back at the abandoned house that had become the center of their operation. "But I was sure of our plan. Moran had trapped himself. He had no choice but to follow the usual script. He was unable to adapt to the new world." Watson nodded, but there were still a lot of questions in his mind. "Sherlock," he began after a short pause, "how could you disappear for 3 whole years? Why didn't you let me know you were alive?" Holmes looked at him. His face became serious, and for a moment Watson saw in him not only a great detective, but also a man who also suffered losses. "It was necessary, John," Holmes said softly, addressing him by his first name, which was extremely rare. Moran and the rest of the Moriarty network were still active. If they had known that I was alive, they would have continued to hunt for me and for everyone who was dear to me. I had to disappear in order to disrupt their plans and gather enough information to destroy the entire organization. It wasn't an easy decision. Watson was silent for a while, thinking about what he had heard. "I could help," he finally said. "I thought all this time that you were dead. I've lost you." Holmes looked at him carefully. "I understand, Watson. You have no idea how hard it was for me to hide from everyone, especially you. But this was the only way to complete everything. And here we are. The case is closed, and Moran is no longer a threat." Watson, somewhat mollified, nodded. "It's good that you're back, Holmes," he said, trying not to betray the depth of his emotions. Holmes smiled slightly. His face softened, and there was that familiar gleam in his eyes. "I'm glad to be here again, Watson. We've been through a lot, and I think there are new adventures ahead of us." And although London was plunging back into its usual bustle, for both of them this night was the end of a long and difficult journey that began 3 years ago at a waterfall in Switzerland. Now it was all over, and Watson felt that he had finally found his friend again. After the arrest of Sebastian Moran, events unfolded rapidly, like an avalanche launched from a mountain. In the evening of the same day, the London police made an official statement in which they revealed the details of the capture of one of the most dangerous criminals. However, the main surprise was ahead. The news that Sherlock Holmes, whom everyone thought had died 3 years ago, was actually alive, instantly captured all the news feeds. The internet exploded with the news. Social media was flooded with posts and comments where people expressed bewilderment, admiration, and even doubts. Sherlock Alive became one of the most popular hashtags within a few hours. The article about the return of the brilliant detective spread like lightning, and even the official BBC and the Guardian news agencies made their headlines about this event. Holmes found himself in the spotlight again, only this time not through the usual newspaper articles, but in the form of viral memes, blogs, and discussions on forums. "You knew this was going to happen," Watson said when they finally returned to Baker Street. "You're back in the spotlight." Sherlock Holmes, sitting in his favorite armchair, just shrugged his shoulders. "It was inevitable," he replied, crossing his legs. "But frankly, I don't care what the internet says. My business is investigations, not fame." Watson grinned at his friend. Despite the years, Sherlock Holmes remained as unwavering in his priorities. "I wonder how you're going to hide now," Watson asked sarcastically. "After all, now everyone will recognize you on the streets." "Oh, I'm sure they'll forget in a week, as they usually do," Holmes replied. "In the modern world, everything is changing too fast. Today, people are discussing one thing, and tomorrow it's old news." Watson nodded, and he smiled.
Thank you for watching this video to the end. If you liked it, please like it and subscribe to the channel. See you soon.